corporate payroll kind of adds on like a third layer to the entire payroll system and the way things roll together. And basic payroll in Wellsky is going to all flow from a visit function. You know, you're paying per visit usually with the basic payroll, whereas corporate payroll gives us the ability to indicate paying maybe potentially rates per hour as opposed to just that flat rate per visit. But the same kind of principles apply as to how the rates are generated, which means a schedule is created, tasks are scheduled into our patient's charts, and those tasks are going to eventually give a certain rate to each of our clinicians. So this all needs to be set up, and we're going to talk about that as we go through the training today. But I just want to make sure that everyone understands the way that these kind of layers flow together. We've got our tasks, which are the things that are scheduled to the patient's charts. And each of those tasks are assigned a visit type. All right, and so those visit types are basically a payroll piece that lets us know how much a clinician is going to get paid for the subset of tasks that are attached to them, right? So we can say, you know, visit types for things like, you know, admissions. Maybe we pay a little more for an admission, and regular visits, and then maybe we have a visit type for wound care visits because we pay a little more for those, or something like that, right? Any differences in pay that you have for your clinicians, you're going to want to create different visit types for. So this is all going to actually be set up under the Go-To dropdown under Reports Admin. And if I scroll all the way down to the bottom, we've got these two different sections for our tasks. We've got one section for our tasks, and we've got one section for our visit types. So tasks are under the task details section. All the way down at the bottom of our reports admin section under administration, we've got here on the right side, task details. So I'm going to click on there just to give you an idea of what this screen looks like. And I want you to be very careful if you ever come into this task details section, because you can kind of mess things up in here. Just beware of that. You don't want to come in here and start clicking buttons if you're not 100% certain of what you're doing. But as I scroll down, you'll notice these are all the different tasks that I can schedule into a patient's chart. And I'm scrolling down here just to kind of stick with nursing. I tend to think that that's usually my default when I look at tasks as nursing. It is the default tab that you go into when you're in a patient's chart. And I've got a whole bunch of nursing tasks here. And you'll notice for these nursing tasks, I've got all these different columns, one being treat as order. Obviously, I'm not treating my nursing tasks as an order by default, right? In some cases, you may create a task that you want to treat as an order, but there's nothing in my particular instance that is treated as an order by default. So this is what I mean when I say, be careful. If you click that box, that's going to send those tasks over to your orders manager, maybe, for example, right? And so we don't want to do that necessarily unless we're 100% certain that's what we're intending. We've got billable. So these tasks are going to go to the billing manager, right? Or go on to a claim. Payable, this is what we're talking about today, which is payroll, right? If this box is checked, this task will flow through payroll. And when we run our payroll, that's going to be a task that will be paid for potentially. Now, units, this is a way we can track productivity units under task detail, so that's another thing. And then we've got this visit type. So visit type is what I was mentioning before, where it's the second layer, right? So if tasks are our first layer, each of these tasks have a visit type, which is kind of like our second layer. So you'll notice each of my tasks have different visit types potentially. Most of them are routine care, but maybe I've assigned, say, to a start of care, an admission eval visit type, because I want to pay a little more for those start of care tasks. Now, these visit types are actually managed over in a different section, which is my visit type section. So if I go to Reports Admin, and I'm going to go ahead and scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page where I see visit types here. Now, while tasks, you need to go through our support team to create new tasks, visit types, you can actually create them yourself, as many as you want. Like I said, you're going to want visit types for all the different kind of rates that you're going to pay your employees for. If there's a separation in rate, if you're paying them more for any certain types of visits, you're going to want different visit types to indicate that. And so I've got a bunch of visit types here. You're probably going to see a different list in your instance if you're looking at that right now. But you'll notice here I've got the visit types. I've got a default rate, which I set my default rates to 0, and the reason for that is typically I pay all my different clinicians usually a different rate. So if I have a default rate in here, when I add a new clinician into the system, it's going to default that clinician's rates to whatever I have in the default rate. I personally like to put 0 in here because it forces me to go in and actually put that clinician's agreed upon rates in there. Whereas if I put defaults in there, I run the risk of potentially paying them the wrong amount. So that's just kind of my own personal opinion. If you have a relative, similar rate that you're paying all of your clinicians, you can put that in as a default, and it might save you some time when it comes to setting up their profile in the beginning. You'll notice here now, again, we're talking about the second layer. So task is attached to a visit type. Visit types, you'll notice, will attach to cost centers. Now, if you're in here right now, you probably aren't seeing these two columns because in order for you to see these columns, we need to set those cost centers up, which is something we're about to go and do. But I just wanted to kind of show you how this entire kind of thing rolls together. Okay, your tasks, your visit types, and then your cost centers, and those all flow into each other. So from here, now we're going to jump into our corporate manager dashboard, which is going to be up here at the top of the screen. You'll notice if you've got a drop down here, it means you're probably set up. You've got your corporate dashboard here. If you do not have this drop down, likely you're going to want to make sure you either get in touch with your agency administrator to see if you can get a corporate account created for yourself, or you don't have corporate manager created for your agency yet, and you're going to need to go ahead and take a look at that link that I put in the chat on how to get set up with that. So I'm going to go ahead and jump over to my corporate manager dashboard. And we're going to start now with the first and the easiest piece to set up when it comes to corporate payroll. And that's down here. I'm in the administration section. You'll notice if I go to, I've got two different sections, administration and billing. We're not going to touch billing today, but I just wanted to show you that that existed. I'm going to go down to administration here, and I'm going to click on corporate settings. The first thing we need to do is set up our payroll week or payroll period. Our organization probably has a payroll period. How does that work? Well, we select which day the payroll period begins on. So you can select a day from Monday through Sunday. And then how many days you want to run that payroll period for, 7, 14, 21, and 28. You're going to leave the payroll cutoff section here as 0. You don't want to touch that. Just leave it at 0 because it's not a function that works within the system right now. So just leave that at 0. You're going to set this as appropriate for your agency. You're going to click that save button, and you're done. That's the first piece of how to set up corporate payroll. Super difficult, right? Not really. Just kidding. That's the easiest thing you're going to do today, probably. So from there, now we've set up our payroll week, which really is going to come into play when we want to roll all of our instances up into one corporate payroll report. So if you only have one instance, this isn't really even going to play a role in your setup, but you do want to make sure you complete it anyway because it is necessary to fully roll out your corporate payroll. You want to get that payroll week created. From there, I'm going to select administration. I'm going to bring myself back to that main screen here again. And now we're going to jump into what I think is the most important piece to setting up corporate payroll, and that is your cost center administration, okay? So you'll notice it's this first option that I've got here. I'm going to click on that. And this brings me into a screen. If it's the first time you're clicking in here, you're not going to see any of what I see right here. All you're going to see is this add new cost center row. And you'll notice we've got the option to add a description, a code, a category, and a type of cost center. We're going to talk about each of those. Now, I've got a bunch of examples created that we're going to reference as I go through how to kind of create these cost centers and how to manage them. But this is where you're going to be building out your different cost centers. Now, again, this is that third layer, right? These cost centers are going to flow into your visit types, or there's also types of cost centers you'll create that will completely ignore the entire flow that I just talked to you about with the visit types. And those are cost centers that are not related to visits. This is another thing that you're getting with corporate payroll, is that you can create payable items in the system that are not related to patient tasks. And the cool thing about that is, you know, if my clinician is in the office for a meeting maybe, and I want to make sure I track the time that they're in there and pay them for that time, I can create a cost center for that meeting, right? If I want to pay someone for on-call time that they were on, I can do that as well. So there's all kind of different cost centers that you're going to be creating. Now, the first column that we're going to look at here is the description column, and this is going to be basically a description of what this cost center is. Now, it's important when we're setting up this description that we are very clear as to what this cost center is, and you want to make sure it's clear to your average staff member. You don't want this to be a code or anything that payroll is going to only recognize. Basically, make this something that describes the cost center, because your clinicians or your staff members are potentially going to see these descriptions when they're selecting it in the time card. And we'll get to that a little bit later. But the main thing here when it comes to description, you just want to make sure it is very clear as to what this cost center is based on the description. Now, code, and I also want to say here, by the way, I'm going to speak about these cost centers from just a basic standpoint, and then we're going to go back and talk about them from the company mileage standpoint as well, because you're going to have to set these cost centers up to tie into company mileage. So we are going to get back to that, but I'm going to just kind of mention this from just your basic cost center standpoint first. So description, then you got code. So code is basically going to be your pay code. If you're exporting this payroll report into a third-party software, maybe like a, QuickBooks or an ADP, and that software is going to identify these payable items by a code or general ledger code or a pay code, this is where you're going to enter that code, okay? So it's a free text field. You can use digits, any numbers or letters that you want to use for that, and this would be pretty much specific to your organization, kind of like category as well. Now, category is another column that is free text that you can use to identify different payable items by category. You'll notice when I get down here into some examples, I've created some for QA, I've created some categories for clinician, some categories for training. Basically, you can use this however you see fit within your organization, but it's a way to categorize the different payable cost centers within your payroll. Then we get into what is probably the most important selection that you make here, because this will determine how this cost center behaves within the system, where it goes, how it behaves, what it's going to do for you, okay? And I've got 4 options that I can select from in here. I've got patient task, office, on-call, and hourly calculation. You'll notice missed visit is not a selectable option. This is something that will be coming in the future potentially. So we're going to start with patient task and hourly calculation, because these are the 2 types of cost centers that will flow into that little layering system that I mentioned earlier, right? The cost centers that are paying for the different tasks that are scheduled into your patient's charts. Patient task is going to be a cost center that I want to create where I am paying a flat rate for a patient's task, right? So nurse goes out, they do a visit, they're going to get paid a flat rate for that visit. We're not going to touch how long that they're in the visit. They're just going to get paid one rate. If I set up a cost center for hourly calculation, now I want to consider this visit, on an hourly basis. Maybe we have high-tech visits where clinicians can be in there from anywhere from an hour to 3 hours. And I want to make sure I pay them for the time that they're in doing that visit. So I may want to set up a cost center for hourly calculation for instances like that. Now you'll notice I've got a couple basic examples that I've set up down here. If we look at the bottom, we've got SN hourly and we've got SN visit. So these are just some examples. SN hourly, notice I've set up hourly calculation because I want to pay the skilled nurse for their time that they were in on that visit. Whereas SN visit, I'm just going to pay them a flat rate for the visit regardless of their time in and time out. So those are your 2 different types of cost centers. And those, again, we'll go ahead and look at these again when we go back to visit types later. But these are the 2 types of cost centers that are going to flow into those visit type columns where we can set those cost centers in there. The other 2 types we have are office and on-call. Now, these kind of work similarly in that one is a flat rate and one is hourly, but now we're going to take visits out of the equation. We're not talking about visit types. We're not talking about tasks. These are cost centers that we're setting up for things unrelated to the patient's chart, unrelated to patient tasks, right? If I set up a cost center with the type of office, I'm now paying an hourly rate for something, right? So for example, I may have a staff meeting and I want to pay my staff every hour that they're in that meeting, right? I set up my cost center for staff meeting. I select the office type. And then if the staff member is in there from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m., they're going to get paid for those 3 hours that they were in the office for that staff meeting. Now, the other cost center type we have is on call. And this is just going to look at a flat rate for whatever it is. Whatever this cost center is, there's different examples you could use for this. On call is probably the easiest example. You pay a certain rate for someone to be on call for the evening or for the weekend, right? Doesn't matter how many hours it is because it's always going to be the same amount of hours. I'm just paying them, say, $100 for them to be on call. Then I would set that cost center up as an on-call. But I've also got some examples like maybe you're paying some coders. Maybe you pay coders a per diem rate for every code that they do, right? You may want to set up an on-call cost center for Oasis coding. Stuff like that, right? So these are all the different cost center types. And I would say now, hopefully you're following along in the student guide, but I'd say now is probably a good time for you guys to take notes on this, because specifically these types of cost centers and what they are, and you'll notice this is on page 4 of the student guide. Patient task is flat rate for patient's task. That's pretty easy, right? Hourly calculation, an hourly rate for patient tasks. Still pretty easy. When you get to office and on-call, it's a little less obvious. You might want to make a notation of that, whereas office is an hourly rate for something unrelated to a patient task, on-call, a flat rate for something unrelated to a patient's task. All right, and we're going to get into how those kind of work and how you can indicate that you're utilizing these when we get into the time card later, specifically the types of cost centers of office and on-call. Now, let's talk about company mileage, because we need to set up potentially these different facilities that our clinicians are going to be traveling to in the middle of their day, right? Clinicians have a whole day worth of visits that they're completing, and company mileage is going to track the distance and the route that they're taking between all their different patient visits based on the times that they're at those patients' homes, right? So what happens if in between Mike's house and Sally's house, your clinician goes and has to go over to the lab? We want to track the distance. We want to track that they went to that lab, they went out of their way to go to the lab, and then they went over to Sally's house, right? How we're going to set that up is we're going to have to create cost centers for each of these locations. So you'll notice here, I've created some cost centers with the description. You'll notice I put mile in there for each of them, and I've also indicated the category of mileage. Now, in company mileage, and this is something that you're going to get in a separate training, you're going to create these facilities. So we're going to look at, say, Dagobah back office. This is one of our other offices that our clinicians maybe had to stop at in between visits, and I want to make sure I track the travel that it took from them to go to Mike's house, to Dagobah back office, over to Sally's house, right? So over in company mileage, you're going to create Dagobah back office as a facility, which is all great. But your clinician's still going to need to indicate that they went there inside Wellsky as well. So we're going to need to create a cost center in there to link Dagobah back office into the facility that you've created within company mileage. The way you're going to do that is through this code right here. So this code is going to be set as the code that you use for the facility in company mileage, and you're going to use that as the code that you create within the cost center, next to that cost center, attached to that cost center, to match as a cost center. Now you'll notice I've also selected the cost center type of office, because your clinicians are going to have to indicate that they went to Dagobah back office inside their time card. Now that's going to become more clear to you once we take a look at the time card, but I just want to make sure that we're clear on this, is that your cost centers need to be created to match the facilities that you've created within company mileage. And the way those two are going to be connected is through this code that you've set on that cost center. And that code needs to match the code that you set inside company mileage. Otherwise, that's your cost centers. You're going to need to create those cost centers. Like I said, this is the biggest piece when it comes to setup that is going to need to be set up when it comes to getting corporate payroll rolling, right? You need to have all these cost centers created. Every different type of item that is going to need to be paid for is going to need to have a cost center created for that. Now, before I leave this screen, because what we're going to take a look at next is how these cost centers will tie into the visit types, which is something I kind of gave you a preview of already, but we're going to go back and take a look now that we have a wider view of what these cost centers are. Before we jump over there, though, I want to take a look at this assignment tab. You'll notice at the top, there's a place where it says cost centers, which is where we are now. There's also this tab here for assignment. Now, this is kind of a little out of order for the things that I'm talking about kind of logically, but I just want to kind of throw into your mind the idea that maybe I've created all these cost centers, life is good, everything's set up, and then all of a sudden, I'm a payroll, I'm sitting there while I'm plugging on my payroll, and my administrator walks in the office and they say, you need to create a new cost center. We need to pay our staff for this new training that they're going to be attending, and it's a different rate than just the regular staff meeting training. It's a special Wellsky training or something, right? So you need to go in and you need to create the cost center for this training. And then I'm going to show you later how you can assign rates to each of your individual clinicians or your individual employees for each of these cost centers. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, if I'm assigning rates to each individual employee, I need to go, well, maybe I've got 300 employees. I'm going to need to go into all 300 of those employees individually and assign a rate for this new cost center. It sounds like a nightmare, right? Well, the way that you can avoid that is by using this assignment button, because basically instead of assigning rates per employee, I can assign rates per cost center using this, which is really what it's used for. So you can filter out your employees based on their clinic or the type of user that they are. And you're going to go in, you're going to select the cost center. So I used Wellsky Training as an example. So we can go down and select the cost center of Wellsky Training. And when I go in and apply filters, it's going to give me a list of all of the appropriate users that I've selected from, right? Now this is where I can go in and I can say, all right, I want to pay this guy one rate, this guy another rate, or this girl one rate, this girl another rate. And I can go down the list and say, all right, I'm paying Jeff here $100 for the Wellsky Training, $100 an hour, but I'm only going to pay Obi-Wan $20 an hour. And then we'll pay Donkey Kong $150 an hour because he might throw a barrel at us or something, right? So you go in, you assign the rates, and when you're done there, you go to the bottom, you're going to click Update Assignment. Another thing that I want to point out here when we're assigning these rates is that some of these rates are 0 and some of them are NA. Big, big difference here, and this is going to play a huge role when it comes to company mileage as well. NA means that this user is not to have access to this cost center, all right? So if you have people who will not be attending this particular training, well, they would have NA there because you don't want them to be able to even select from this when they get to their time card, okay? But 0 just indicates I'm not paying them. I still want them to see it. I'm just not paying them a rate for this particular cost center. So it's a really important distinction here. If there's a number in the amount column, they will be able to see this cost center when they go to select from it in their time card. Okay, so it's really important. Why this is so important when it comes to something like, say, company mileage is because you'll notice all of these different mile options that I have here. So we want potentially, we want someone to be able to say they went to Hogwarts, right, during the day while they're doing their visits. If I don't assign a number, which is going to be 0. We don't want to pay them to go to Hogwarts. We just want to be able to track the mileage. So we're going to put zeros in for anyone who needs to be able to travel to Hogwarts. I'm going to go in here under assignment, and I'm going to want to make sure that I select the name. And so for everyone, I'm going to say Rocky needs to go to Hogwarts. We want Tommy Callahan to go over there. And we want, Donkey Kong needs to be able to go there as well. And I'm going to put in zeros. So any clinician who potentially will be going to Hogwarts, we want to make sure we're putting a 0 in there because remember, 0 will allow them to select this cost center in the time card. NA is going to not even give them access to this cost center. All right. And remember, if we want them to be able to say they went to Hogwarts, they're going to need to be able to put that in their time card that they went to Hogwarts. All right. And we're going to get to that when we get to the time card. It'll make a little more sense when we see that over there. I'm going to update my assignment. Always remember to click that update assignment when you're putting numbers in here. I don't want you to lose your work, and that's just the thing across Wellsky. There's always that button in the bottom right corner. You need to click that button to make sure you've saved any work you've put in the system. Otherwise, you're going to lose it, and you're going to be really unhappy with yourself. And probably with Wellsky too. You're probably going to be cursing Wellsky at that point. But so that's cost center administration. We've got the cost centers. We got to set them up there. And then you also have this kind of cool ability under assignment to be able to assign rates per cost center as opposed to per user, which is what we're going to get to in a little while. So let's go ahead from here and jump into how we tie the cost centers. Now remember, this is how to tie cost centers of patient task and hourly calculation, those two types, how we tie those into our visit types, right? So let's jump back into our agency level. I want you to take note of the fact that these cost centers the administration of the cost centers is done at the corporate level. So if you're an organization that has multiple different locations attached via one corporate dashboard, you're going to have to set, well, the cost centers are going to be set up on the corporate level, and then you're going to have to set those up via your visit types and tie them into your visit types in each different location. Okay, so that's an important thing to keep in mind. I'm at the agency level now. I'm going to jump down to reports admin, and I'm going to scroll down to visit types, right? So now we're going back to level 2. right? If cost centers is level 3, we're going back down to level 2 with the visit types. And we click in here, you'll notice now these per visit cost center and hourly calculation cost center have new meaning all of a sudden, right? Because per visit cost center, those are those cost center types that we set up with the patient task type. Hourly cost center are any cost centers we set up with the hourly calculation type, right? So from here, we can select. Now, I've set up some examples, really basic, right? Routine per visit. I have a visit type for routine per visit. I want to pay per visit rate for any tasks that are tied to this visit type. And I've only selected a cost center of SN visit for that, right? So I select that. That particular visit type is always going to have that cost center's code and all the information from there, category. Now, I also have a visit type here for routine hourly pay. You'll notice I've only selected a cost center in the hourly cost center column, right? Because I want to always pay hourly for any tasks that are tied to this routine hourly pay visit type. Now, I also have a routine care visit type. And in this case, I want to have some flexibility. I want to pay some clinicians hourly. I want to pay some per visit. In this case, I've selected a cost center under both of these columns. What this is going to do is now on a clinician by clinician or a staff by staff member basis, I'm going to be able to decide, do I want to pay this guy hourly or do I want to pay this person per visit, a flat rate, right? And we're going to go ahead and take a look at that now. How do we assign rates to our individual clinicians? And I'm going to use my good friend Luke Skywalker as an example for this. So we're going to go in there, I'm going to go to, I'm going to select Reports Admin, and I'm going to scroll down the page to users, all right? This is where I see my library of all the different users that I have in the system. And I'm going to go over, and like I said, we're going to go ahead and take a look at Luke's user account or his user page. I click on there, and this is of course where HR is going to put all of Luke's information, and he decides to be very secretive about where he lives, so I don't have his address in there yet. But when I go in here, I'm going to click on Edit, and I'm going to select Rates. This is where I'm going to assign how much I want to pay Luke for all of the different visits and all the different pay items that we've set up, right? Now you'll notice under default rates here, I've got all those visit types. This is how much I'm paying Luke for all the different visit types that we've set up that potentially have our cost centers tied into them, right? You'll see here is my routine hourly pay visit type that I set up. You'll notice there's a little checkbox here next to hourly, which indicates any rate or any visits that are done with this visit type are always paying hourly. Now remember, routine care, this, I had the option. Do I want to pay them per visit or hourly? We have this little checkbox that I can check or uncheck depending on how I want to pay this particular clinician. So that's how you can kind of set that up if you want to pay hourly or per visit. And then you go in here and you've got your rates. So obviously this is the dollar amount. This is how much I'm paying this particular clinician for these particular visits. Now we come down here, these are all the cost centers I've set up that are not related to the visit types. These are our items that are, staff meetings and on-call and that kind of thing, right? The cost centers that were set up with the office and on-call cost center type. And you'll see in here, remember I talked about how there's a difference between 0 and NA. When I'm looking at this screen, NA is basically a blank box, all right? So if we don't want them to be able to access, you'll notice I've got some cost centers set up here for billing specifically, right? If this person's not a biller, I don't want them to see those billing cost centers, so I'm going to leave those boxes blank. However, if I want this clinician to do that, in this case, maybe Luke is a coder, I want to make sure that he has access to these coding cost centers, right? I also, of course, Luke goes and flies all over to do the different visits for us. I want to make sure Luke in particular, and you with your clinicians, you would want to make sure any of your clinicians who are in the areas appropriate would have access to using the mileage, these company mileage locations that you've set up as well. And to do that, you're going to put in 0 as the rate for each of those. Because remember, you need to put a number in there in order for them to be able to select from them in the time card, which we're going to take a look at when we get over to that time card in just a minute. I know you've been eager to see it at this point, I'm sure. And then, of course, down here, we've got our Wellsky training. I want to make sure anyone who was in that Wellsky training has the ability to go in and select that from their time card. So we put that rate in there and how much, of course, we're going to pay them. And in this case, we're paying him an awful lot of money for that. Top right, you'll notice we can also select specific rates per payer. So this is kind of going back to our visit types. How much are we paying? You know, maybe we're paying a different rate if the clinician needs to go do a visit for a certain insurance company. Maybe the insurance company's visits are a little more intense or less intense, and we want to pay a little more or less for those visits. We can set rates individual to specific insurance companies as well, which can be pretty nice. Alrighty, so that's how you set up your rates per user. All right, the other thing that we want to keep in mind, I'm going to go back to the edit profile page. We also need to make sure we have checked include in payroll. If we have a specific date in mind where we want this clinician to be included in the payroll, maybe we want them to have access to their time card and start having visits flowing into payroll as of a certain day, we can put the as of date in here, or we can just make sure that include in payroll is checked, which is going to indicate this clinician should be included in payroll. All right, so you want to make sure that that box is checked as well when you're setting up these user profiles. Alrighty, I think it's about time we take a look at the time card. All right, I'm in the go-to dropdown. You'll notice I've got an option here for time card. This is only going to show up if this user's been included in payroll and I've set up corporate payroll. So all the things we've talked about as far as setup goes, creating cost centers, setting up that payroll week, all that stuff is going to need to be done before this time card option is going to start to appear for people. All right. And another little secret, a little thing you might want to take a note of right now is you need to create at least one cost center of each type. This is really important. So I'm going to repeat it now. In order to have corporate payroll fully roll out within your organization, you need to create a cost center of at least one cost center of each type. So if you find yourself in a position where you're like, you know what, I don't pay my clinicians hourly, maybe. I don't have any hourly pay for my clinicians. Create a fake one in there. You can create a placeholder or whatever. You may not pay hourly or you may not pay per visit to your clinicians, but create at least one of each type, and if you have to, create a fake one. That's going to allow you to fully roll out corporate payroll within your organization, because if you only have 3 of the 4 types, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to roll it out all the way. So take a note of that. Let's go ahead and jump into the time card, which is right here. Let's go to select time card. It's going to bring me into my time card. Now, I think the time card is really, really cool. Now, it's necessary because we need to use the time card in order to input times, which you'll notice I see right up at the top of my screen here. It says add time. This is how I'm going to say I want to get paid for a certain thing, right? However, I like this as kind of a motivational tool for my clinicians as well. Right? You'll notice here a clinician is going to be able to see all the different things that they'll potentially be getting paid for on the next payroll, right? And you'll notice some of these things are in yellow. This means the clinician hasn't submitted that visit yet. So this is a really, really cool kind of reminder to that clinician. All of these lines that have yellow highlights, that's like dollar signs in their mind. This is like, whoa, I better get this stuff submitted if I want to get paid for it, right? It's always a struggle having your clinicians turn stuff in on time, unfortunately. And this is just another little reminder to them that they better get it in if they want to get paid for it. Now, the other thing, of course, is that they also just have a list of all the visits that they're potentially going to get paid for on the next payroll. So it's another kind of, instead of them calling and saying, hey, do you have this visit? Is this visit included? Do you have this visit? They've got that information right here in their time card. All right, so this is kind of a little hidden benefit to having this corporate payroll, in that they can kind of see all that information themselves when that clinician comes into their own time card. Now, from there, if I want to add time, I'm going to click on this add time button up in the top left. And this is where, as a staff member, I can say, I want to get paid for the time that I spent, say, maybe in a Wellsky training, right? We're in a Wellsky training right now. So let's go ahead and say, as of today, click on this little calendar. We'll select today's date. And I'm going to select the cost center of Wellsky training, right? Now, remember, these are all the different cost centers that I have a rate assigned. Notice I don't see the billing ones because I didn't assign a rate to myself for the billing cost centers, right? So I'm not even going to see them in the dropdown if I don't have that rate in there. Wellsky training, I'm going to pull up the branch and the cost center type. I'm going to put in my time. We'll go ahead and say we started at 11 a.m. and we're finishing up at 12 p.m. All right, so I go in, I click add, and now it's included in my time card, right? So there you have it. I'm going to get paid now for that hour that I spent in Wellsky training because I put it in on my time card. So the next time payroll is run, that information is going to flow into the payroll. It's going to give whatever rate is assigned to me for that. I'm going to get paid for it. So that's pretty cool, right? And remember, of course, it also showed that cost center type up here, which office means I'm going to get paid hourly. If it said on call, means it's a flat rate. Now, what about company mileage? How does company mileage work? For those of you who are setting up these facilities and you want to be able to track the time or the distance that the clinicians went to these facilities in between visits, right? So we'll use that example of the clinician goes to Mike's house, they got to go to Dagobah, and then they got to go to Sally's house. So we want to track kind of the fact that they went out of their way to go to the Dagobah. Now, the system's going to track it by time. So if they were at Mike's house at 10 o'clock to 10:30, and then they were at Sally's house from 12 o'clock to 12:30, that time in between is when they went to Dagobah. So they're going to say here, okay, as a clinician, we'll go ahead and add time. And I'm going to say now, all right, on 7/26, I went to Dagobah at 11:30, right? And I was there until 11:45. So now, when I add this, company mileage is going to see that this clinician was at Mike's house at 10:30, they went to Dagobah at 11:30, and then they were at Sally's house at 12:30. So it's going to be able to track the fact that they went to Dagobah in between those two visits because they entered this into their time card. Now, I stress, this is very, very important in the fact and why it's so important that your clinicians are timely with their documentation. If the clinician forgets to do this, if they don't do this before the payroll is run, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to track those miles. So this is a really important step if you want to be able to track the fact that they went, to Dagobah in between those two visits. Obviously, the visits is going to happen naturally because they're putting in the time and time out on those visits as they complete them. This piece, on the other hand, is not exactly as fluid. It doesn't happen as naturally. So you want to make sure, I would say, as clinicians, you want to probably lay the groundwork early as you get them used to using this company mileage piece. I'd probably say if they can do it right away, great. But at the very least, at the end of their day, they should probably make it a process to go in and enter in any times or any places that they went other than clinic or patients' homes during that day. And that way they don't forget the time that they were there either, right? So there you have it. That is how the time card works. And basically, once all their visits are done, once they put in their information into the time cards, you're going to go ahead and run the payroll when the day comes that you need to do that. And all this information, all these things we put in on the time card, all the visits that were completed are going to flow into that payroll. The way we run our payroll, of course, is going to need to be done on an agency level basis, right? So I'm going to select Reports Admin. I'm going to scroll down there to Payroll Manager. So this is where payrolls run. For some of you, you may already know this. Like I said, this kind of portion is already covered for you in the reports and admin or the administration training that you have through your basic home health series. Now, Payroll Manager is where we're going to run that payroll. We see here, very simple. Select a branch. We pick start day, end day. You'll notice start day is a whole year ago. End day is today. End date you would put in as your payroll cutoff date. It's okay that the start date goes back a year. In fact, it's probably a good thing because if a clinician turns their work in late, we want to be able to capture that and pay them for it on the next payroll. So maybe your clinician went on vacation to Aruba and they were out for a whole month and they got a whole bunch of paperwork that they turned in like a month late. You want to make sure you're capturing that. Now, with the way Wellsky Payroll runs, every time a visit flows through payroll, it's flagged as paid. And that means it's not going to run through your payroll again. All right. So basically, if I go back a whole year, I'm only going to be picking up visits that have not yet been flagged as paid, which means they were probably turned in late if they are coming outside of your payroll week. So from there, I go ahead, create my payroll. We'll go ahead and just do it up to today. And like I said, it's going to pull up all the visits that have not yet been flagged as paid. And you'll notice some of these visits are checked, other ones are not. Most of these are checked, but you'll see this Hans Christian Andersen visit down here, not checked. If I go on to page 2, whole bunch of visits that are not checked, right? The reason a lot of these visits are checked and some of them are not, this is all going to be based on whether it's been approved by QA. So as a payroll staff, you may decide, okay, this visit for Supergirl and this visit for George Clooney, it's not the clinician's fault. They turned it in on time. It's still sitting in coding for whatever reason. So I want to make sure I pay them for that. Those would have to be checked manually because it's only going to default to check visits that have been approved by QA. So you want to keep that in mind. If your QA is caught up, then you shouldn't really have to worry about that. Now from there, once we've selected all the visits we want to include in this payroll, we're going to create the payroll. Before I show you that though, there's this export data to Excel. I get sometimes people will ask me, how do I export this information? You know, I want to look at all this information before I actually run it through payroll, before I create the payroll. You can just click this export data to Excel. You can get all this information on a spreadsheet and then you can review it as needed. All right, and that might be really important as well for any of those company mileage indications, right? If you want to kind of look at all of how that the entire trip is going to look, you want to make sure those company mileage, you know, the facilities are going in between the visits that they're supposed to. You can go ahead and take a look at it here before you actually create that payroll. When I click create payroll, that is going to flag all these checked visits as paid. It's going to create my payroll report, and then I will have access to that through this Excel link right here. So if I click on that, it'll download my Excel file. I'm going to open that up here so you can take a look at what that looks like. You'll see here, this is what my Excel looks like. So all that information we added, the cost centers and all that good stuff is going to be included here. So remember, there's your category. There's the cost center code that we set up there. Of course, the type of visit and the date and all that information. And we move over, you got your insurance, you got your time in, your time out, how many hours, the rate. Now, mileage, I want to be specific about this. This mileage column is not going to be pulling from company mileage. It has nothing to do with company mileage. This is from a field that the clinician can fill out for the amount of miles on each visit. So if you're utilizing company mileage, you may just decide that you do not want clinicians using that field, in which case this particular column is not going to be used. It's not going to be relevant. You got your surcharge and the total amount in that column. So that's what your payroll report's going to look like on an agency level. Now you can pull this over to the corporate payroll level as well. So a lot of agencies don't do the roll-up function, but it is available to you if you have multiple locations and you want to pull all of those locations' payrolls up into one corporate payroll export. So I'm going to go from here. Oh, and before I do, actually, I want to show you too. If I go to view previous payroll, I'm in Payroll Manager. I have the option of going back and viewing any previous payrolls, and maybe let's say I accidentally created that. I'm like, oops, I didn't mean to generate the payroll there. I can always go back and click that delete checkbox right there and delete that payroll, which will basically, all those visits that were checked off, marked as paid, it's going to uncheck those. It's going to bring that entire payroll back to where it was before I just did what I just did, right? So that's something you can do. It's kind of an emergency button there if you need to delete a payroll. Wouldn't recommend doing that if you can avoid it, but obviously it's sometimes necessary. Now, once I've run that payroll, I can then go up into the corporate dashboard again. And you'll notice I have the option here for Payroll Manager. So take a look at that. Now, this is the corporate Payroll Manager. And basically all this is it's going to look, and if you've done any billing manager trainings, you'll recognize these little red X's. They'll turn into green check marks every time a payroll is run in a location, right? So I'm going to look to see, has my home health payroll been run? Has my hospice payroll been run? Awesome. I'm going to know that because you're going to have these little green checks. And once you have those, I can check these boxes, I can run the export, and it's going to roll all of that together into one payroll report for all of the locations, as opposed to having all these separate payroll exports for each of your different locations. So again, not everyone uses this. You'll notice the show pay period here. This little payroll week is being generated by the first thing that we did. If you bring yourself all the way back to the beginning of the training, that first thing that we did when we created that payroll period based on the day of the week that it starts and how many days it runs for, well, it's creating that for you now based on that information that you input. So if you are using this roll-up, this is a really important piece to that. Anytime I export a payroll as well, I will have that exported payroll listed over here in the exported tab. So right up at the top here, you've got create payroll, which is where I'll export it. And then any previously exported payrolls that I've done are going to be available for download here forever for me to take a look at. So if I made a mistake or there's, I want to go back and look maybe at a payroll that was run a few months ago, I can always go back and get those files. And when I say make a mistake, if I had to rerun this, I'll just have the bad file there, and then I'll have the good one that I ran as well. So you'll have access to all those payroll files for forevermore. So that, folks, is corporate payroll.